This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at Montclair.edu. Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
The One Big Beautiful Bill made some big changes to the federal student loan program. What does this mean for students?
It's impossible to determine what the administration is trying to do. The most positive way of looking at it would be to say the changes to student loans are designed to eventually make the system simpler. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that the overarching goal is not increased access to college. There are going to be a lot of unforeseen consequences.
Our guest is Dr. Sandy Baum, a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and one of the nation's leading experts on student debt and college affordability. Welcome, Sandy. It's so great to see you.
Hi, it's nice to see you.
So, Sandy, let's cut to the chase. The One Big Beautiful Act contained a ton of provisions that affect student loans and college financial aid. It's a lot to kind of condense, but if you had to break it down to a bottom line, like who are the students that are going to be most affected by the new law? And if college is going to be less affordable for some students as a result, who is going to bear the brunt of the changes in student financial aid going forward?
Well, the bill is so huge and has so much in it that it's hard to actually, get to all of the details. But the student aid changes that are most significant have to do with student loans. And there are really two categories of those changes. One issue is eligibility for borrowing. And so there are new limits on borrowing for some student loans. And the other issue is repayment. So, in terms of borrowing, it's not undergraduate students whose borrowing capacity is affected. It is graduate students and parents of undergraduate students. So the bill eliminates the Grad Plus program. That makes it sound like they're eliminating borrowing for graduate students, but they're not, because graduate students currently borrow in two ways: through the federal direct loan system and then also through the Grad Plus loans. And currently, they can borrow almost an infinite amount from Grad Plus loans. They can cover all of their educational expenses. That's gone. And there are new limits on the total amount that graduate students can borrow. But this is just graduate students. That's really important. And then the other issue is that there are also new limits on how much parents can borrow to support their undergraduate students. And again, it's not that the program for parents was eliminated. It's that it used to be, or is now, that they could borrow up to the full cost of attendance to cover all of the expenses not covered by other financial aid. And now there will be limits. So that's one issue.
So I want to ask a little bit more about the details on these limits and then who these limits are going to impact in particular. I'm assuming with the graduate students, we're talking about professional students, like medical students, law students, business school students are going to be PhD students are going to be in trouble. In fact, the president of the American Medical Association called the graduate student loan limits, quote, a punch in the face. Like, how impactful is this going to be on the future supply of doctors, lawyers, MBAs, professors?
Well, if you look at how many graduate students now borrow more than what the new limits will allow, there are a few categories of students. First of all, professional students will be able to borrow more than master's degree students and research doctoral students. It's not entirely clear which programs will be categorized as professional. So, for example, one of the programs, which if you call it not a professional degree, that would be very much affected would be PsyD, psychology doctoral degrees. And those students, like half of them, I don't know the exact percentage, would be very much affected by the limits. But if they were categorized as professional degree students, then those limits would be significantly higher and it might not be a problem. So master's degree students, the most likely to be affected would be those studying social work or fine arts, other occupations that don't pay so well. Um,
Mm.
but again, it's not most of those students. It's, maybe a quarter of those students who are now taking grad plus loans would hit their limit. But you're right to mention doctors, because doctors and dentists are really going to hit their limit, or much more likely to hit the limit. A much larger share of people studying medicine and dentistry now borrow more than what the new limits will allow them. So it will not be surprising that medical schools will be, making noise about this. I could imagine that being something that would change, it be adjusted in the near future, because it's already true that very few low-income students go to medical school. This could make it worse.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, the limits, if I get these limits right, they seem kind of low to me, especially we're talking about graduate school and medical school, capped at 20,500 a year with a lifetime graduate limit of 100,000, and that's 138,500 with the previous limit, I think. And then the medical professional degrees, it's a borrowing cap of 50,000 a year, and the lifetime cap is 200,000. I mean,
Right.
isn't medical school like $100,000 a year?
Medical school is much more expensive than that, and certainly particularly private medical schools. But, if you think about the master's degree programs, there's a real problem. I mean, take the example of Master of Fine Arts. I mean, a lot of students borrow more than $20,000 a year to pay for those programs, but they don't make much money when they graduate. So the question is going to be, what is the impact? If the impact is students who really need to borrow more than $20,000 a year have to make another choice, we could debate how serious a problem that is, because if they get those degrees, they're very likely to be unable to repay their loans. That's a really different
Right.
story for doctors, because doctors are very likely to be able to repay their loans. And so the limit seems really too low for doctors. It's not clear, although there are differences of opinion about this, about whether it's too low for a Master of Fine Arts. A Master of Social Work is a very complicated one, right? Because it's a huge problem. They pay a lot of money and they don't make much. Maybe the programs need to be cheaper. Maybe there's another solution. It's going to raise a lot of new problems, and people are going to have to seek solutions for some of them.
And we're not talking, especially with the doctors. You mentioned that low-income students will probably shut out as a result, but a lot of middle-class families will find themselves really stretched as well, right?
That's right. And again, the thing is that, paying for medical school, law school, at some of these institutions, they do ask for information about parents, and they do have institutional financial aid programs, and this would be wealthier institutions that subsidize students who come from low and moderate income families. But the standard way of analyzing ability to pay for graduate students ignores their parents, because they're independent of their parents. So, but clearly what happens is that affluent families are, reasonably likely to help their kids pay for law school and medical school, whereas most families can't do that.
Yeah. Now, who takes out Parent Plus loans as far as income? Is it middle-class parents who take out Parent Plus, or is it lower-income parents who are more likely to take out Parent Plus? Like, how are those
Right.
limits going to affect?
Well, the Parent Plus loan was initially designed to make it easier for middle and upper income families to come up with the cash, like people who could afford to pay but didn't have the liquid assets to pay, so that they would be able to then pay over time. That made sense. But increasingly over time, more and more middle and low income families have been taking Parent Plus loans because they don't have any other way to pay. So, I mean, a shocking share of people with zero student aid indices, zero ability to pay, take out parent loans. Like the credit limits for borrowing, you can't have a recent adverse credit history, but many people who would never get a loan if they went to the bank get Parent Plus loans and have no hope of repaying it. So a lot I mean, it's not that low income borrowers are more likely to borrow than higher income, but a disturbing share of Parent Plus borrowers are low income.
Mm.
However,
Hmm.
it's the higher income parent borrowers who borrow large amounts. So it seems like the limits on Parent Plus will mean that they are less useful to the more affluent families who are using this as a financing mechanism. They won't solve the problem of low income families, because a low income, if you're living at the poverty level or at 200% of the poverty level, and you take out $15,000 over time in Parent Plus loans, you're not going to have the capacity to pay that back. You're still going to be able to do that. So there are very few really low income parents who are going
Hmm.
to hit the limit. But there are some higher income parents who are going to hit the limit.
Right, right. Which is now $65,000 in the
Right,
aggregate per child and $20,000 a year.
right.
And looking at some of the tuitions that are out there now, a few schools have hit 100,000 a year. That's a 20,000 per year seems like a suddenly small amount to some parents, I'm sure.
Right.
Um,
Although for many of the low income parents, they're getting the financial aid that pays a big part of that. And one of the interesting
mhm.
things is, as you said, $20,000 a year or 65,000 overall. If you borrow $20,000 a year for the first 3 years, you're not going to be able to do that again the fourth year, right?
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
annual and the aggregate limits, it's a little confusing. Like for master's degree students, the annual limits don't add up. I mean, if you're in a 2-year master's program or even a 3-year master's program, you're not going to hit the aggregate $100,000 limit, because it doesn't take you that long to get a degree. So
I
that's
see.
very odd.
It's very odd. So, from what you're saying, there's an implication that what the administration and the GOP were trying to do here was to limit the likelihood of default by certain borrowers. But what do you see as the long-term impact in terms of who gets to go to college as a result of these changes to the student loan programs? Like, what are the distributional impacts of these changes going to be? What unintended consequences do you see
Well,
from
it's
some
not
of these
clear that
limits?
it was a reasoned out way of thinking about limiting default, because affluent parents don't default on their Parent Plus loans. It's the low income parents who should have been given a Pell Grant instead of, or a bigger Pell Grant instead of those parent loans, are the ones who are likely to default when they're still going to be there defaulting, right? Graduate students are increasingly having default problems. And yes, some of those loan limits are about default. And medical students aren't very likely to default. So
Right.
some of these limits are going to help default, like, or if not default, then loan forgiveness under the
Uh-huh.
federal programs. So they are trying to do that. But in terms of not being able to go to college, again, it's not undergraduate borrowing that has been limited. So it might affect some graduate school choices, but the impact on undergraduate students is really going to be the change in the repayment plans, not the borrowing limits.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the repayment plans. So this is a little bit confusing as well. So it sounds like new borrowers are going to have basically only two options available to them, but it's kind of unclear what current borrowers are going to be, if that's going to change as well. So can you explain what these two new options are going to be going forward and how that's going to be different for
Well, first,
students'
let me say
experiences?
that we now have a crazy number of options. I mean, there are multiple income-driven repayment plans. There is the standard 10-year plan. There's an extended payment plan, a graduated. I mean, there's so many plans that students have no idea how to pick what they're going to do. So limiting the number of plans is not in and of itself a problem. However, there will be one fixed payment plan where the number of years you pay won't necessarily just be 10 years. If you borrow a lot of money, you'll be able to extend that for a longer period of time, so you have lower monthly payments. And then there'll be one income-driven plan, the repayment assistance or RAP plan. And it's interesting because when you look at its provisions, it's not simple to figure out who will be helped and who will be hurt. For
Huh.
one thing, the Biden administration tried to implement this new plan called SAVE, which the courts struck down basically. And it was incredibly generous, much more generous than the existing plans. And many more people would have ended up not repaying their loans and having balances forgiven. So if you compare the new plan to that plan, it looks worse for almost everybody. But that's not how people have been repaying their loans. It really never went into effect. So it makes much more sense to compare the new plan to the way that students have been repaying. And in some ways, it's going to be harder for students, and in some ways, it's going to be easier. So,
Can you explain? Yeah.
yeah. So, for one thing, right now, a lot of students in income driven plans, which are plans that say your monthly payment depends on your income. It actually doesn't depend on how much you borrowed, it only depends on your income. And you keep paying until you've paid it all off or until your balances are forgiven. Under current plans, your balances are forgiven after 20 years if you have only undergraduate loans, or 25 years if you have graduate loans. Under the new plan, everybody will have to pay for 30 years. So loan forgiveness is farther in the future. People will be repaying their loans for a longer time under this new plan. Also, a lot of people now have zero expected payment. If your income is below 150% of the poverty line, your payment is zero. They say that income is not high enough for you to be able to make any payment. Under the new plan, everybody pays at least $10 a month. And there are arguments for and against that. I mean, if you have no money, how are you going to come up with $10 a month? On the other hand, $10 a month is a pretty small amount. And there's a real problem that if you've had a zero payment, you're not used to making payments. And some people think that this will help people at least be in the habit of paying their student loans. Some of the ways that it's more generous, right now, one big problem is that if your payments don't even cover your interest, like if you have no payment because your income is so low, but they're charging you interest, your balances increase over time. If you didn't make a payment, but you were being charged $50 a month in interest, then you got $50 more that you owe. And it's really a problem that a lot of people see their balances balloon. Under the new plan, if your payment doesn't cover your interest, the rest of the interest is forgiven. Now, that's going to be huge for some people, like, say, recent medical school graduates who may have borrowed $300,000 and they're in residency and they can't pay, and their interest will be forgiven. And in fact, your principal will, if you have a $50 payment, they'll apply it first to your principal and then forgive your interest. So in that sense, that's going to be much more generous. That could be very expensive. And it's not clear. I mean, again, I think some of the beneficiaries will be very low income borrowers and some will be people who borrowed a lot of money. So that's one way in which the plan is more generous.
That's interesting. And do we know at this point whether current borrowers are going to be allowed to switch into these plans or will be forced to switch into one of these plans? Is there?
Well, some of the the people who signed up for this SAVE program that never really happened, they're going to have to be in one of these plans. But people who are already borrowing can keep their plan for a couple of years and then they will have some other options. It's very confusing. I would recommend that anybody not just reading the options, because I think reading the options will be confusing, but checking in with the school, with the lender, with whoever's collecting the payments, because eventually everybody's going to go into one of these two plans. But current borrowers have some respite about that and do have some other options, but not necessarily the plan that they're currently in.
Got it. Okay. I want to turn a little bit to lower income students and in particular Pell Grants. Now, they did manage to dodge a bullet with this new law because earlier versions of the legislation, if I remember right, included some pretty steep cuts to Pell Grants for low income students. But because there was so much outcry from community colleges, from student advocates, the final law did not go forward with most of the cuts, or pretty much all the cuts, to the Pell Grants. But there are some pretty significant, there's at least one very significant change to the Pell Grant, and that is the ability now to use Pell Grants for short-term job training programs, which could mean that adult learners might have access to Pell they didn't have before, but there's also a lot of questions about the quality of these new programs and whether there are sufficient safeguards. So what's your overall take on so-called workforce Pell and if it's going to have a beneficial impact as
Yeah, I
intended?
mean, I have mixed reactions to Workforce Pell. On one hand, currently, the program has to be 15 weeks to be covered. There are a lot of programs that we currently cover with Pell that aren't very good and that don't do much for students. Lowering the length of the time period to 8 weeks, it's almost only going to let in some programs that don't serve students well, but it's not clear that the current dividing line is solving that problem either. So the real question is, what about the protections? Like, to what extent are they eliminating programs that don't have good outcomes? And they claim to have some protections in place, but I think a lot of people think those protections are not going to be very effective. The
Mhm.
protections we have now are not very effective. So there will probably be more people getting a Pell Grant and then enrolling in a program that either there are no jobs at the end, or the nobody finishes it, or it's very expensive and they end up borrowing a lot of money despite the Pell Grant. I mean, one of the things that people have found is that there are lots of programs, say, in for-profit institutions that are not eligible for federal student aid. They tend to be much cheaper than the programs that are eligible. So
Huh.
if you make people eligible for a Pell Grant, what if it just gets more expensive and that Pell Grant just covers the new cost? That would be a problem. Now,
Yeah.
it's going to help some low-income students enroll in programs that really can help them, that are quick and can help them get a job. So some people will certainly be helped. Um, Community colleges like for that reason, but it's really hard to know. It's easy to say, wouldn't it be great if everybody could just get a few weeks of training and get a good job? But the problem is that a lot of people go get short-term training and they can't get a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess one example of a program where it could be helpful possibly might be, say, a commercial driver's license program. I mean, I think that's the program that everyone held up as kind of the, exemplar of a program that could benefit from short-term Pell assistance.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you could have the 10-week cosmetology program that where the
Yeah.
person ends up making $10,000 a year or nothing. So,
But right now, cosmetology programs are, I mean, so many people end up defaulting on their loans. Cosmetology programs are just the biggest problem we have. So I think this change could benefit some people. It could add to the problem, but it doesn't really create a new problem. It's a problem that we
mhm.
just haven't solved. And it's going to be worse because in this bill also there's a new accountability measure, which is what standards do programs have to meet to be eligible. And in this case, it's just for federal loans. And
Mm,
it's an earnings criterion that excludes certificate programs. I mean, the programs that have the
interesting.
biggest earnings problems are certificate programs. So we haven't tackled this problem.
Yeah, yeah. So let's turn to that and talk a little bit about the so-called accountability earnings test, I guess. And as I understand it, basically an undergraduate program can lose access to federal loans if graduates earn less than someone with a high school diploma. Do I have that right?
Right.
And
That
so
the
the
median
and
earnings, yeah.
okay, and then the idea here is to improve quality and guarantee a return on investment. So you've already mentioned that there's one problem with that it's not including certificate programs, but what impacts do you see coming as a result? Are students, for instance, going to be able to tell which programs are worth it and which not? Like, how is the data going to be
We don't
deployed?
know how the data, all these things, like the data, especially because we don't have anybody in the Department of Education who's overseeing data anymore. They fired all those people, right? So
Oh, right.
all of
Yeah.
these things are going to be. I mean, the Department of
Data.
Education has been so demolished that any of these things are going to be very difficult to implement. The new repayment plans. I mean, it's hard to imagine how any of this will be carried out. But these earnings limits are not going to have a huge impact because you have choices. It can be median earnings nationally for high school graduates, or like in the master's degree programs, it's compared to median earnings for bachelor's degree recipients. but it could be nationally, it could be in your field, it could be
Mm,
in your state. Um, so it just looks like there will be some programs that fail, and then their students will not be eligible for loans. And you have to remember that some schools don't participate, particularly community colleges. Many don't participate in the federal student loan program anyway. The students can still get Pell grants, and that will still be the case. So it really
mm,
seems like, there will be a few programs that are affected, but this is not going to have a very big impact because it's not a stringent enough requirement and because of the limitations in the programs to which it applies.
Yeah, you've already alluded to this a bit on the implementation piece, but just a reminder to everybody out there that there was this massive Dojification of the Department of Education. How do you see, well, the skeleton crew that's left at the Department of Education being able to implement all of this, any of this? What's going to happen to student loan checks
I
this
can't
fall?
imagine.
Let
I
alone,
think there are going to be some real problems. I mean, it's really hard to imagine. I mean, all of the data, I mean, they just now, it's like the conversation about the new executive order, I guess it's an executive order, that schools submit to the federal government information about race and ethnicity and test scores and so on. But all of the people overseeing the data that on these issues and the data set that of which this would be a part, they're not there anymore. So it really seems like either there'll be a crisis or they will hire more people back or they will, I don't know, give somebody else the responsibility for carrying out these data collections. I have no idea how it's going to work.
yeah, and the New York Times reported that out of the 100 people who are employed by the National Center on Education Statistics, there were four left.
Right.
So
Yeah. It's a huge
it's
problem.
it's a mess. So, final question for you. If you had to take a step back and kind of look at the overall impact of this new law for college students and affordability, what do you think is the underlying rationale or philosophy or anything for all of these changes? Like, what do you divine from
Yeah.
this piece of legislation? What the administration is trying to do?
You know, uh, it's impossible to determine what the administration is trying to do. They're trying to stir things up. Um, the most positive way of looking at it would be to say the changes to student loans are designed to eventually make the system simpler, to ensure that more people repay their loans so that taxpayers are not on the hook for unpaid balances, but to maintain reasonable loan programs. That's the best way you can look at it. Um, and some of the changes do suggest that they're trying to do that. For example, the fact that they are forgiving unpaid interest is it's an increased subsidy to borrowers who are struggling, and it's something that advocates have been lobbying for a long time. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that the overarching goal is not increased access to college. I mean, the overarching goal is somehow make it seem like taxpayers are less on the hook. And I'm not sure how much this is going to save. So I wouldn't begin to try to analyze the philosophy behind these. And this is, it's all these things are put together very quickly. And there are going to be a lot of unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay, so this is my actual real final question. If there's one thing that you could have done to fix the student loan system that was not in this bill, what would it have been?
So two things. One is that we should base we should adjust for inflation. So when you put a limit in or an earnings threshold, for example, the new student loan repayment system, it's based on, there's a rate attached to your income. If your income is between $10,000 and $20,000, this is your rate. And 10 years from now, an income between $10,000 and $20,000 is going to look really different. So we don't do enough adjusting for inflation. We should do more of that. But also, students too many students default or are delinquent on their student loans. Many of them, it's because they really can't afford the payments. But for others, it's because they prioritize other things, because they don't know how to make the payments, because it's bureaucratically very difficult, because it's very difficult to get into an income-driven repayment plan. In other countries, you are automatically placed in an income-driven repayment plan. So your payments are automatically an affordable share of your income. We could do that. Other countries just withhold from paychecks, and then students wouldn't have to worry about how to make their payments. I know there are arguments against this, but to me, making the program simpler and easier for students to manage could be huge, and they haven't done that.
Well, Sandy, thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciated the chance to talk to you.
Okay, happy to talk. Thanks.
Take care.
Okay.
This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at Montclair.edu. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.